Hello, this is the Politics and Letters podcast. I'm David Barfield with Jim Livingston. Today we're going to be speaking with David Levering Lewis. David Levering Lewis is a professor emeritus of history at New York University. A recipient of the National Humanities Medal, Lewis received the Pulitzer Prize for each volume of his W.E.B. Du Bois biography. He is the author of 11 books. Lewis has received fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, the National Humanities Center, the Wilson Center, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, and the MacArthur Foundation. He lives in New York City. And with that, David, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I hope.
That's a long list of fellowships there, I'll tell you. Wow. It's good to have you. We're going to talk today about David's recent book, which is seems to me, revisionist history of the relationship between race and class for the entire span of American history. Although, okay, let's keep it to the 19th and 20th centuries. But it's also an autobiography, and it's quite extraordinary in its insights both into American history, but also it has the novelistic quality of the particular circumstances of the Lewises seem to follow the thread or the thrust of American history. So I'm reminded of Albert Murray's book, The Omni-Americans. Your family, David, seems to fit that specification quite exactly. So with that, it's called, by the way, The Stained Glass Window. And we, of course, urge you to go out and get that book. But as an introduction, would you please tell us how you came to it and a little bit about the composition of it? However you would like. Here it is.
Sorry.
However you'd like to get us into the swing of it.
Yes. This is a family history, as you say, and that is a departure for me. I had not done family history before, per se, I think. And it came at a time when I was really quite reflective about my origins. I had lost a partner of 30 years, Ruth Ann Stewart, and that left me sort of unanchored. And I thought I just would kind of visit places that had some resonance for me. And one such place was Atlanta, which is not my birthplace at all, but has family history. And I found myself at an old church, a congregational church, indeed the first congregational church of Atlanta. And it has peculiarities, to be sure. It came straight out of the embers left by Sherman's march. And it was the source for Atlanta University, which was the first school in the South that was interracial, to the increasing consternation of Atlantans, but it began that way. And it was probably, from the point of view of class and caste, a very particular church in that it was color-centric, I think you'd say. There was a paper bag test for admission, I learned. That is to say, it was a favorite worship space for mulattoes and of successful, generally, African Americans, at least they self-defined themselves as such. And in that church, after the 1906 Atlanta riot, which destroyed much of Black Atlanta, it rose with the contributions and donations from Andrew Carnegie and the Rockefellers and others. And when it was finished, emplaced in its windows were family mementos. And mine was my grandmother, Alice King Bell. And I had always been drawn to that stained glass window without really knowing much about this ancestor. Um, but that drove me to see if there weren't archives that um, contextualized this church in its origins and in its continuum. And surely enough, there were at the new Atlanta University, the new one, that is, the one that was created overnight, as it were, in 1919 through Rockefeller benefaction, most specifically the General Education Board, which became, in the absence of a Secretary of Education or a cabinet office, it became the Department of Education for the United States, in that the largesse of the General Education Board was really quite enormous. And so there at the new Atlanta University, the one created in 1919, and there's a story there about the urgency of its creation, were the archives of this church. And they told me a great deal about not my uh, 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 grandmother, but about the people who ran that church. And I found that my grandfather had been quite instrumental in uh, his caretaking of finances of that church, and that other families whose names were resonated with me, the Walter Whites and the Ruckers and the Westmorlands and others, that all these people had made the church really a great success from their perspective. And then I thought, well, but wait a minute, who is Alice King Bell? And then you, of course, want to falsify your maternal and paternal um, lore. And so I thought, well, a king. I think that she was born on the estate of the Roswell kings. And outside Atlanta today still is a Roswell, um, Georgia, where time has been very kind to it in that it is as lost cause today as it was in 1870, say. And I thought, well, what goes on there? Turned out that it had, thanks to a historian known well to all of us, um, who revealed Thomas Jefferson's progeny, Annette Gordon Reed, that it was now honoring Black History Month. And I thought, my goodness, isn't that interesting? And so I phoned the archivist and I said, I want to come to Roswell, Georgia. I have questions about the possibility of the origins of an ancestor of mine, that sort of thing. And she said, oh, my goodness, well, you'll be quite welcome. Yes, let us know when you're coming, and we will just dig into our archives and see what we have. And I did that. And so from that church, those days when I was in Atlanta, I fulfilled my commitment to drive from downtown Atlanta to Roswell. And Roswell is a charming place. It's largely as white now as it was then in the antebellum period. And there I met the archivist, the chief archivist, um, 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 uh, uh, for a moment, I'm struggling for her name, De Niro. And she said, well, in preparation for your advent, we just dug into what we might have that would be relevant, and we couldn't find anything. It doesn't seem that your ancestor has any connection uh, to the kings of Roswell. Now, Roswell was an interesting place because the family came from South Carolina and Liberty County, Georgia, and it occupied the terrain that the Cherokees had possessed long ago, but had been displaced by Andrew Jackson and the terrible march to Oklahoma of most of the Cherokee. And so this virginal landscape occupied by the kings soon became quite prosperous because exceptionally, the Kings were the only Southern slaveholding family that milled its own cotton. The problem usually was that you had factors who would take the management of your product and charge you for those services, but not the Kings. And so they had fueled by the Chattahoochee River major mills that took care of their product, wool and cotton, and they were exceptional in that regard. And indeed, one of the cotton fibers produced the Confederate gray of the officer class of the Confederacy. All of this I learned from Miss De Niro, Elaine De Niro, as we walked about Roswell. There was a lovely church that had been built by slaves or the enslaved, and their reward was to benefit from the American Colonization Society's transportation back to the homeland, back to Liberia. And so it was truly an interesting place. And the number of colonnaded mansions there, of Smiths and the Bullocks and Kings and others, I thought that surely Margaret Mitchell must have visited and had her inspiration. And in fact, I thought that Tara in the Hollywood film must have been based on the Barrington King mansion. But no, Miss De Niro said, no, it was in fact the Bullock mansion, a rather more brutalist design, but the residency of Theodore Roosevelt's mother. I said, well, that's interesting. And so we walked to the river where the mills were powered and saw that. And then Miss De Niro said, well, Professor Lewis, I think we have said about all that we can really say about any plausible connection of your family line to the Kings. There is a gentleman, an African-American minister, who has a very useful um, list of all of the African Americans going back into the past, and you might consult him because it's possible that he would know something about a king. And so I left her. It had been a pleasant morning, and I drove back to Atlanta and the airport, Hartsfield-Jackson, and flew back to New York City. And within 3 weeks, I got a huge bundle from Miss De Niro with an explanation. She said, "Dear Professor Lewis, indeed, I misspoke. It turns out that you, in fact, do have connections to these kings, and you'll find the contents of this certified package of interest." Well, now, I think I did know something about the kings, actually. I think I knew that they were famous for miscegenation, that they had always violated the code of racial separation by producing people who were related to them. And so it seemed that one king, Roswell King, um, had indeed uh, been the ancestor of some African Americans. And in that certified packet, in fact, I found two things, which I reproduce in the book. A bill of sale of acquisition of one Elsie and William in 1822. And they purchased these slaves and several others in that year. And a few years later, William, who was 1, and Elsie, who was 3, presumably conceived their first child. And that seemed quite productive of William to be able to do that. However, the first child was named Clarissa, a rather fancy name, the name indeed of one of the best-selling early Victorian novels of Great Britain. And Clarissa was born in 1835, and she grew up in Roswell as a favored person until one day she was suddenly sold away. And that happened in 1850, I believe. So she was about 17 years old when one of the kings, Barrington King, sold her. And there was a document provided by Miss De Niro of the sale with penciled in, "Gone by Barrington King." Well, it was a good price, as a matter of fact, something like $1,300 for 2 or 3. Convert that into modern currency, and you have quite a profitable exchange. Something else I noted, too, from the census, that most of the enslaved on Barrington King's Roswell landscape were women, and very young. And so you might imagine that they were, in a sense, ready currency for the kings. You have a slave, young slave, somebody wants one, you sell, and you've got an operation that is economical. All of this was a puzzle. And then the archivist said, "And I don't know where Clarissa was sold to. I'll see if I can't find more." And she did soon. And she said, Why, yes, it seems that she emerges in 1850 in Houston County on the plantation of one James Wiley Belvin. And there the story stops. She said, however, I'm going to share with you a few pages, very dark pages they are, just in terms of clarity, that are part of a family history written by a descendant of James Wiley Belvin. And it's quite curious, she said, you will find, that he wrote it to satisfy himself, with no thought, of course, of any public access to it. But you'll find that it is interesting. Well, I certainly did find so. And to skip ahead a bit, I ultimately acquired the entire document from the Perry Historical Society archives. Perry, a very successful little town, smack dab outside Macon, in Georgia, Houston County. Well, Pete was his name, the author of this family history. And it goes back to the beginning in South Carolina of his ancestry. And it ends with the death of what becomes Major Belvin in 1886. And Pete, in his innocence, describes everything in an unadorned way. That was the way life was. This is the way we thought about our lives and what have you. And so it was unlike so many monographs or memoirs of slaveholders. It was pure in its innocence, I thought, interpretive innocence. Well, I thought, so who is Clarissa? I need to know more. At that point, though, I was finishing another book, a book that was devoted to Wendell Willkie, a Republican presidential candidate who I found quite extraordinary for various reasons. And so I had now to both consider the options that Miss De Niro's information presented and the story of Wendell Willkie. And at this time also was being the first election accidental of Wendell Willkie. I'm sorry, of Donald Trump. And so that was significant to me because along the way, the interaction in Roswell with Miss De Niro and the politics of the nation, I had to finish Wendell Willkie, flown to Minneapolis to interview people who knew Wendell Willkie in his salad days. And I was met at the Minneapolis airport by a chauffeur who told me things about his town, sort of Chamber of Commerce advertisement as we rode along. And I would say, well, yes, that is interesting. And I will be here just a few days, but thanks so much. But then he said to me, he said, and you know, my people never did anything to hurt your people. And at first I wasn't quite sure uh, what action was being described. But he said, my folks came over from, I think he said, Poland. You know, we didn't have the language, but we worked awfully hard. And so we succeeded. And I'm a retired supermarket manager. and I'm making sure that my nephew gets to law school, and I'm helping. He says, and that's our story. But we know that you guys have had a hard time, but we are just innocent of this entirely. And I couldn't say anything to him. I was dumbstruck, literally. And so when we pulled up to the hotel, I got out and I had almost nothing to say to him and went into the hotel to be with the Wilkie people. But I thought, I need to think about this because of my own inadequacy. And it was complicated and advantaged by the fact that David Nassau, a well-respected American historian, had recently telephoned me out of the blue to say that I was to receive the final Arthur Meyer Schlesinger Writing Award or his Historian's Award as it was being terminated for various reasons, in part the death of Arthur Schlesinger. And I thought, well, that's an opportunity to speak about American history, the kind of history that Arthur did, which was all kinds of history, uh, the uh, the presidential histories, the uh, books on cycles in American history. Uh, Arthur had covered everything and enjoyed himself so well in that he knew people in Hollywood and people in the academy. And so I was to sum up his life and from it say something about my own at the Century Club, I think it was. And there with Arthur's widow and his son, and of course a galaxy of historian poobahs. I gave my talk, and in it I said that the curious thing I am discovering is that the people who are so responsible for so much in American history are absent uh, or caricatured. And indeed, that if you read materials about African Americans, you find that their opportunities are fixed, as it were, by zip codes that uh, generally are not productive. And that seemed to me to be an inaccurate way of viewing lots of American history, and I thought I wanted to do so. And so, um, that's what happened. But I had to have a book, and I had a new agent, and I said, you know what? It may be that this is just uh, a prospectus that my life is in its white descent, in its intermediate mulatto descent, and in its black descent, really the amalgam of what this country is about. And indeed, it may well be that through Clarissa and some other people, I could go back well beyond the federal moment of the 1790s. And that would be really an ambitious, but it could be serviceable uh, monogram. And that's where we are.
Well, I'd say it's more than a monograph, as what you have said, as what you explained to us so eloquently demonstrates. So let me press you a little bit on what you just brought up, that your family history really does represent this omni-American quality of the African American experience. You know, you have white descent, mulatto descent, African American descent, black descent. Um, so yeah, it seems. I mean, the question you're raising is like when you say the people who are responsible for American history, and then you refer to Black people, and then but the question that you were, I think, raising when you spoke at the Schlesinger Prize event, what do we owe the past, and not just us historians, but like your driver in Minneapolis. What do we owe the past? What do we owe the people who have come before us? And that's, I think, the really basic question of the book. Um, and so if we may, if we can't, let's talk about some of the possible answers here. Okay. David has this really, I think, really important question, and this my question might be background for his, but let me see if I can pose it here. The the you're the amalgam. Your family is the amalgam of what this country is, as you put it. And I think that's exactly right. Um, and so within that amalgam, both class and race figure very prominently in your book. It is a an account, if you will, of miscegenation, as it seems to me every account of every great achievement in this country must be just that, an account of miscegenation. Okay, but you mentioned the General Education Board and the Rockefellers, and one of the key characters in your book is your father, who was a president of several educational institutions in the South, as well as in Ohio, um, in this long period of this long moment of the 20th century. So, what here's what I'm trying to get at. Towards the end of the book, you mentioned E. Franklin Frazier's book, The Black Bourgeoisie, and you use the word lampoon to describe the way it describes the Black bourgeoisie of the 20th century. Um, but there is a in your book this constant thematic of uh, you call it the privileged and alienated amongst Black folk as against the truly disadvantaged, so that the tension between the two classes uh, within the Black community, the Black nation, whatever you want to call it, is a constant figure in your narrative. So I guess what I'm asking is there some truth in the way that Fraser characterizes the Black bourgeoisie as analogous to a colonial elite, which is desperate for foreign capital from the General Education Board, from the North, to try to develop a less developed area of the country, which we might call the Black Southern United States. So that yes, Fraser does lampoon the Black bourgeoisie, but is there a certain truth in that? And was that status as a colonial elite something that some of the Black bourgeoisie was reluctant to give up? Its standing within, shall we say, the the Black nation. I'm not sure that this question is making any sense. But
No, no, it certainly does. I remember that when I first heard of E. Franklin Frazier's book, it was soon after we returned to the South from Ohio, uh, for my father to assume the presidency of Lawrence Brown College. And the book had just come out, and I believe that my mother had read the French version, though.
Mm.
So she was quite upset by his uh, um, victim portrait of this group. She thought that it was perhaps indeed because he himself was unwelcomed by these people that he had turned on them and portrayed them in such ridiculous ways. But one was mindful that this was a a group that had been quite successful, it thought, in Atlanta, as in, say, Durham, North Carolina. You had a comparable group of people who had risen on their bootstraps in conjunction with banks and insurance companies, and that sort of thing. And so what did this mean? Well, I already knew what it meant because I had had a rare experience with the man who had created that class, in a
Mm.
sense, and that was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois's talented 10th. And it was to befall me as a 13-year-old, I think, to meet William Edward Burghardt Du Bois with my father as he was about to address the group that had come out of the talented 10th construct. And that group was called the Sigma Pi Phi, or the Boule, and it was hereditary. That is to say that you had to be male and you had to be distinguished, and your son and your son's son would be part of this group with their wives. And so Du Bois was there, and I met the good doctor, and he said to me, "Were you part of the group of young people who performed this morning at Galloway Hall?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir." I said, "Would you like to hear what I said?" And so I began, and he said, "Well, quite enough, thank you." Uh, and he spoke to my father, John. We're members of the same group. And he spoke to my mother, who had been a student of his when he taught long ago at Atlanta University, the original one. And so he walked into Galloway Hall, and then I followed with my parents uh, to take a seat. And there was what I have described somewhere as the African American 400. Every person there was special in terms of his accomplishments. The first architect, the first banker, the first mortician, the first minister, and so on. A very proud group, and Du Bois was to address them. And the expectation of the message was so thrumming, you know. And Du Bois said to them, "You have indeed failed me. The talented 10th was an idea, not of self-service, not of hypocrisy, but to those to whom much is given, leadership is presumed, and you have not followed that." And he went on to say, in this total silence of the assembly, that someday you will have to benefit from the revelations of Karl Marx, and you will have to realize that it is not a talented 10th we need, it's a guiding 100th. And he said, and each time you meet, each 4 years when you meet, you must expand yourself so that this group becomes the people themselves.
Mm.
And of course, everyone was shattered by this revelation. And this was also a time when the evocation of the wisdom of Karl Marx went pari passu with summonses before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and the necessity of evoking the Fifth Amendment to say, "I'm the who me," that sort of thing. It was a very deadly time in the high noon of the Cold War. But more than that, it was the abrogation of this design that Du Bois himself had conceived, that had the full commitment of a class of people. And yet, although shattered, indeed, as people left the Galloway Hall, Du Bois was seated on a bench, and they passed him by, and no one said anything to him. They were so destroyed by what he had to say. Well, but this is what Franklin Fraser was kind of saying in his Black Bourgeoisie. And it was not surprising that Fraser would have had this idea and had this derogatory conception as a close ally of Du Bois's, and as indeed a criticism that today stands enshrined in a very fine Harvard PhD. No, it isn't. It's Harvard. It's Duke, I think, by an African American historian who tracks the performance of this group in its irresponsibilities and in its collaboration with the oppressor, as it were. That is to say, Atlanta was outstanding in that way, in that the insurance companies, the black ones, the bank, the federal bank, the Citizens Trust, the only member of the Federal Reserve, the real estate entity that made money available for purchases of things. All of this came out of remarkable success, business success of this class of people. So there are two ways to look at this. Today, indeed, there is a kind of nostalgia in that integration brought about the co-optation of those institutions, the absorption of those institutions, and in a sense, the loss of the control that these groups had over higher education, over banking, over various niches in the capitalist agora. So there was truth, and at the same time, there was a kind of smart acidness about it as well.
Right.
Going back to Du Bois, perhaps. But there's also another way of looking at it. And Martin Kilson, for example, has written recently in his retirement, a book about those people who kept things from falling apart, who pledged themselves to literacy, to professional integrity, to success, and that instead of thinking that history begins with, say, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, you have to step back and realize that what was called the nadir that came out of the Wilson presidency and others was filled not as a vacuum, but filled with people of industry and dignity and momentum. And so that is a kind of merciful view of the history of the group across time.
Yes. David, you want to? David Barfield. Yeah. Did you want to?
Oh, well, I wanted to say, just for anyone who is watching this who doesn't know, the structure of the book is, the way you set it up was through a series of national events, policy issues, court cases, and so forth, and interwoven into that, or your family's history interwoven into that, however you want to look at it. And one of the things that, I guess it goes back and forth, right? I was struck by a quote from a judge named William Harper.
Yes.
I was wondering if I could read that, or if you would like to read it. I can put it up here.
No, you should read it.
I'll read it. Okay.
Yes.
Well, William Harper says,
1835,
1835,
South Carolina,
Carolina.
William Harper, judge.
Yeah. Let me read it with a clear throat so I don't screw up any words. But he says, we cannot say what admixture of Negro blood will make a colored person, opined Judge Harper in 1835. The condition of the individual is not to be determined solely by distinct and visible admixture of Negro blood, but by the reputation of his reception into white society and having his commonly exercised the privileges of a white man. It may be well and proper that a man of worth should have the rank of a white man, while a vagabond of the same degree of blood should be confined to the inferior caste.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so
That is so remarkable. And yes, it underscore it. I was a colleague of at the old Federal City College of Ira Berlin when he was just getting started, and when his first book, the book "Slaves Without Masters," appeared. And I remember him running into my office and saying, "Hey, David, do you know about these Slaves Without Masters? Because that's the book that is going to appear." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I think I do." Well, what? Because Ira was wrong when he said that that intermarriage was uh, um, uh, a violation that the South would not allow. Uh, But South Carolina was the exceptional. Indeed, uh, if you uh, if you behaved in ways that evoked the respect and the collaboration of white society, then in fact you were white. And so, indeed, the immersion of people of certain descriptions in South Carolina had been a constant, uh, rather mimicking Louisiana and New Orleans, although the difference between the two is really quite significant. As a historian at Cornell, whose name I'm not going to remember at this point, pointed out that that indeed the privileges of whiteness in Louisiana were quite total. That is to say, you had mobility, you had latitudinal movement in that group, in that Gallic group that lasted until really the possible war. But already in Charleston, there was a paring back of it because by the eve of the Civil War, what had happened was that in Charleston, all of the intermediate activities were controlled and monopolized by people of color, free people of color, the fire department, the tobacconists, the tailors, the cobblers, the what have you. And what had happened was that the poor whites or whites who, um, so the two things happened. Nobody would migrate to the South as immigrants began to come down the gangplank in America. You didn't go south because you knew that there was really not much place for you except to be constables, and that is to say, police work for African Americans. In other words, the Irish, for example, were defined in the South as constabulary. And that was a problem for their mobility. And it was expressly the case in Charleston, where finally, in the 1850s, a mayor having to make a choice between the greater class anguish of whites over this monopoly resulted in choices made for the first time to say, we will promote your needs. And so at the moment that the Civil War begins with Beauregard, you had the demand in the Columbia legislature of re-enslavement of African Americans who had gotten out of their place.
Hmm.
And Columbia was much more responsive to, because it was the upcountry, to the whites, the lower class whites. And so the aristocracy in Charleston then began to have to wobble between two things. The revenues that they got from the blacks who monopolized these positions, and they gave a percentage of their earnings to their masters, which made them rather unwilling to compromise that. One, and two, the the fact that uh, there was an out of this misogyny, there was affectation, there was collaboration, there was counter a counter narrative of empathy, you might say. And so it's really interesting that just as Beauregard is firing, the mayor of Charleston, for the first time, begins to signal that he must be responsive to the upcountry whites.
Hmm.
However, you have, as Larry Koger has demonstrated, a former student of mine at Federal City College, who then went on to write a book called Black Slaveholders in South Carolina, a revolutionary book, and he's disappeared completely. I think he still lives. He works as a GS-13 or something in Washington. But he was a brilliant student of mine who said, I want to know more about these people, Professor Lewis. And he went off and he wrote his book. And the book countermands things that Carter Woodson found to be true, things that John Hope Franklin found to be true. That is to say that the uh, the how shall I put it, the readiness of African Americans to be slaveholders themselves and to perform in ways that were consonant with white slaveholders was quite shocking.
Hmm.
Because Carter Woodson had said, for example, and John Hope Franklin had said, that this happened in order to have people you were related to advantaged. It gave them a certain latitude. But no, time and again, it turned out that the slaveholding black population of South Carolina was in no way different from the white slaveholding population. And so you can see then that when the upcountry whites are saying, this is a preposterous arrangement here, that Charleston has this intermediate mulatto and free person of color and free person monopoly that's getting in the way of us. No way. Well, so that the language that happens when the South secedes is that this population pledges its allegiance to the Confederacy, just as it did in Louisiana. However, because of the wisdom and the logic of slavery, the slaveholders refused to allow them to fight alongside them because until the very end, when finally it changed that law. So That is the particulars of class conflict, endlessly fascinating in South Carolina.
Could I ask you,
Yes,
you think that that dynamic or that consciousness or however you want to put it, does that exist today?
no, it does not. I think, fortunately or unfortunately, the 1896 Supreme Court decision uh, introduces uh, the one drop phenomenon. And once that happens, increasingly, African Americans have to choose whether they are white or black. And so the numbers are for deciding one is black. But you see in my family a kind of ambiguity in terms of the census for 1900, 1910, and then comes 1920 when the word goes out that this will be the last time the census will have an intermediate category. And at that point, a great outmigration of African Americans who are phenotypically dubious to California, maybe 150,000, according to Walter White, migrate out to the California, so that this business of identity is very labile for a long time. But of course, today it is sort of an historical embarrassment to talk about groups who tried to articulate these various fissures in identity. And you certainly see it in just that moment that I deal with of the uh, of the um, of the Harrison presidency of 1890, where two attempts to save the Republican Party in the South and to save the African American happened. The Lodge Force Bill on the one hand, and the tariff bill on the other, where the North said to the white South, "You've got more illiterates than anybody else, white and black, because their system had never had public education to speak of. And if you will accept the high tariff to develop the industrial North, we will make it possible for you to have a surplus of monies, which can then be used to upgrade education in the South." And they even agreed that it would be separate but equal. It would be black and white. And the leadership class of the South, the names that speak volumes, and I can't recite them now, they all said, "This is a deal we go along with." But there were people who said, "Oh no, if you do this, then you will admit the possibility of uh, um, a political control of our race relations in the South. If we get the money, don't think that with that money won't come some complications." And so the Blair education bill failed completely. Uh, the Lodge bill also did as well. And it's interesting that the president at that time who returns to power is the first Democrat, of course, Cleveland, who, like Trump, is bringing back cancellations of what is left of the Reconstruction legislation and statutes.
So if if I'm understanding your response to David's question, if I'm understanding David's question, one way to read your book is as, at least implicitly, as a history of not just race, but racism. Because what I hear the two of you discussing is the possibility that racism has nothing to do with hatred, or very little to do with hatred. It has a great deal to do with power.
Mhm.
One's position, whether fulcrum or not, within a political economy. I mean, that's how race gets defined, and that's how racism operates in this part of the world. Is that a fair characterization? And
I think it is, and I think that was what Du Bois realized when he said that the problem of the 20th century is not the color line, it's the manipulation of the color line by the rich.
That's not that is certainly true today, right? We can all agree. Yeah.
yeah, right. Here's another way to I think e- maybe complicate instead of clarify the exchange that you two have had here. Um, and I mean, one of the stories you tell is the creation from scratch, really, of Black higher education, the building of what we now call historically Black colleges and universities by, among other people, your father. Um, and this during the so-called nadir of Black existence and life in the United States. This period roughly between 1889 and 1954, when segregation was the law, if you will, of the land. You called it a merciful view. Would be to say there's all kinds of extraordinary achievement that happened within this moment. Would it be easier and better to say, not that's stupid. Would it be another way to look at it, to say there is there is a redemptive way of looking at this that Du Bois himself came to embrace in the mid 1930s, and that is uh, segregation as a choice, as a way of saying, maybe integration is not such a great idea. Maybe, our self separation would benefit both sides of this coin. Is that a
Yes, that was Du Bois's point of view, and the fact that the Communist Party also had that idea was complicating, but that's another matter. Yeah, but of course, it destroyed, or it didn't destroy. It, what Du Bois had to do was to destroy the man who ran the NACP, Walter White, and in that infamous and scurrilous attack when he says he's not white, I mean, he's not a Negro. He goes as he will. He's blue-eyed, he's blonde. That's our leader? No. To justify separate equality, meaning really separate, but by God, it should be cooperative movements, whatever those were supposed to be. Right. Um, and, but so where are we now with African Americans in this moment when it is quite clear that here this is the redemptive moment of white supremacy?
well, why am I laughing? Yeah, you're right.
That kinda I had a question about this. I don't know that we'll get to it entirely, but you speak of, I don't wanna read the whole thing, but that there's um, an African American exceptionalism that you talk about, um, and as sort of a vanguard of civil rights, movements, uh, gay rights, immigration, gender. You talk about how, the struggle for Black freedom is I don't know if you would characterize it as a template, but that there's a thread that runs through all of these, I guess that's
Right.
do do we are African Americans willingly or unwillingly, in your estimation, are they in that position now? Do, are they? What do you expect from African Americans with respect to Trump, let's say, or do you have expectations?
I think that pessimism is appropriate, really. I don't think that we are going to end up as, say, Jews did in the Third Reich, but I do think that legislatively there will be so many things that will not advance us that there will be a kind of Afro-pessimism, which will reduce the exceptionalism, for sure. Um, uh, and it's hard to say, because where Trump goes American democracy, really, and that's what we're talking about. And let's say if he receives the Nobel Prize, what he's done, uh, by by indeed, um, benefiting from Netanyahu, uh, okay. And if indeed his tariffs really are perceived to be workable, uh, then we really have the MAGA vindicated. And so all that's going to happen in terms of the brown people who are dying in these concentration camps on their way to the Sudan and odd places whence they don't come. And at the same time, the um, the people who said the price of the expulsion of these people is the price we have to pay, uh, then I think the concern that African Americans will have about themselves will pale to the concern that everybody else who is concerned will have. They say we've destroyed UNESCO, we've destroyed NATO, we've destroyed the EU. Really, it now has to save itself, and perhaps it will, because the French and the Germans and the British, however, the idea of Germans in uniform again is interesting. Um, uh, but it does look like we're at the precipice where the Trump world indeed prevails.
I hope you're wrong, David. But maybe that's a salutary way, or salutatory, I can never figure out which one is right here, way to end our session. I'm not sure that either David or I are willing to end it here, but on the other hand,
Well, it ain't looking good. I mean, this is
no,
No.
no.
and
So, and we know that the 6-3 is preordained. We know what will happen when all this stuff goes before the Supremes, and that's it. And then we will have, I would assume, enough resistance, enough marches, enough barricades, and this will be as welcome to these people in Stephen Miller's world as the governor of California's resistance is. And so he can save the society by using the military.
That's where I think, yeah, push comes to shove. I don't know if the military is gonna go along. We'll see. Ah, Christ. Well, um,
well,
on that note,
I would like to say, though, that your point about the success of the African American story is not to be not to be ignored or undervalued. And there is a sense in which the African American prides himself and herself on being the conscience necessarily of the failure of the ideals of the operation that we call exceptional.
All right. Well, that's better.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. I think
I didn't expect you to be, you know, any less bracing than you have been. So, all
Oh.
right.
Well, we could have avoided this podcast.
oh no.
No, it's something that needs to be said, is, so.